In the opening weeks of this new year, we're considering how we can fuel our faith and deal with our doubts. A lot has been written to suggest that Christianity is not true or that somehow belief in God is toxic and harmful. Our hope in this series is that we'll be able to talk a lot more openly than usually happens in churches about issues concerning faith and doubt. A very helpful book by one of my favorite authors, John Ortberg, titled Faith and Doubt, is the primary source and resource for this series. Last weekend, we talked about the fact that everybody has doubts and everybody has faith. There is no such thing as a doubt-free person, and there's no such thing as a person who has no faith. Doubt, we said, can lead to stronger faith, and even if you have doubts, faithfulness is always on the table. That was last weekend's message. If you've not seen that, I encourage you to go to our website and you can check it out. This message is going to focus on the important and hotly contested topic of faith and science. A lot of what has been written recently suggests that the rise of the scientific method and scientific knowledge makes ideas of faith and belief in God obsolete, or completely undermines the credibility of the Bible. That's what we're going to dive into today. In the second book in the New Testament, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9, there is a story that we're going to spend some time on this weekend and next weekend. I want to introduce the story to you today. It's a story about a father who has a troubled son whom he brings to Jesus. Mark, the author, gives this description of the son's condition. The father says to Jesus, "Teacher, I brought you my son who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, he gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid." When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Now let's just pause right there. What medical condition does it sound like this might be describing? Seizures, epilepsy. This brings up a very important question for thoughtful modern people. Sometimes people will say something like this. In ancient times, when people didn't have scientific understanding, they needed religion to explain strange phenomena. They didn't understand epilepsy or neurological disorders, so they would attribute them to an evil spirit or spirits. They didn't understand about lightning and thunder and polar vortexes, so they would attribute it to Thor or Zeus or one god or another. But now we have modern medicine. Now we have meteorology. So we don't need those outdated beliefs. Or they might say it like this: where do human beings come from? They used to explain it in terms of God reaching down into the dust of the earth and forming a human creature. But now we know that 4 billion years ago or so, there were amino acids in a pool that was struck by lightning, and everything just sort of came together and life developed through that process. Now, the general idea in these statements is that religion was at its heart an attempt to explain things by people who didn't know any better. This is understandable, they would say, and maybe even needed in that day. But in our day, we have science. We are people of science. The scientific method, some would say, is the only way to really know something. Therefore, faith in God or belief in the supernatural is obsolete. The question that we're going to look at together today is this: does the rise of science mean it no longer makes sense to believe in God? That's the heart of the message today. Does the rise of science mean it no longer makes sense to believe in God? Can you have faith in God and be serious about and open to the findings of science? That's another important question we need to ask. These are important big picture questions that, quite frankly, have been a stumbling block to many people in our culture, particularly young adults. I think at the outset, it's important to distinguish what kind of science we're talking about. For example, there is a field that we could call operation sciences. Operation science uses what is commonly called the scientific method to attempt to discover truth, performing observable, repeatable experiments in a controlled environment to find patterns of recurring behavior in the present physical universe. For example, we can test gravity, we can study the spread of disease, we can observe things in a lab or in the wild. Everybody on both sides of the debate uses this kind of science, which has given rise to computers, space shuttles, and cures for diseases. That is not where the faith science controversy is contested. Origin science attempts to discover truth by examining reliable eyewitness testimony, if any is available, and circumstantial evidence such as pottery, fossils, and rock formations. Because the past cannot be observed directly, and because nobody alive was there to see it, assumptions greatly affect how origin scientists interpret what they find or what they see. This is at the heart of the faith science debate. So I think it's helpful to distinguish what kind of science we're talking about. Today I want to make 3 basic observations related to origin science and the Bible. Now at the outset I want to say something to you. This is no lightweight topic. This is one of those talks where I'm going to have to ask that we all roll up our mental sleeves and you put on your thinking cap and you wade through some ideas and material and concepts that most of us don't get into very much. And because of that, every once in a while, I'm going to ask if you're still with me. And I want you to say, we're with you. Even if you're not with me, I want you to say, we're with you. So let's try it out right now. Are you with me? We're with you. Good. Let's start. Observation number 1. Much of the supposed conflict between faith and science in our day comes from a misreading of what the Bible actually says. Much of the supposed conflict between faith and science in our day comes from a misreading of what the Bible actually says. You know, the more I thought about that statement, I realized that actually that statement applies to a wide range of topics. Much of the conflict between faith and any number of things is actually a misreading of what the Bible actually says. As our friend Inigo Montoya from The Princess Bride said, I do not think it means what you think it means. But I think particularly in this area of faith and science that some controversy arises because people disregard or dismiss the original intent of the biblical writers in order to prove their point or to push an agenda. Let me give you a very well-known example. Very well-known, many centuries ago, scientists like Galileo, Copernicus, who were both Christians, they said this: our study of the universe is leading us to believe that the earth actually revolves around the sun. The sun doesn't revolve around the earth. Imagine saying this several hundred years ago. The church leaders at that time said, oh no, Galileo. The Bible clearly says the earth is set on its foundations, therefore it cannot be moved, and what you say cannot be true, and it is heresy. The problem is not that the Bible was wrong or in error. The problem is there was a misreading or a misunderstanding over the intent of statements like that in the Scripture. That misunderstanding undermined faith in God, and it made it look like faith was being invalidated by the findings of science when that wasn't the case at all. In our day, the biggest controversy around faith and science revolves around the story of creation as recorded in the book of Genesis. The opening line of the Bible says this: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Everybody read that with me. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and the world has never again been the same since those words were penned. Perhaps the most important statement ever written. But Genesis was written by a real person, who I believe was Moses, in a real context, to a real audience, to address real questions that were being asked in that day. And the questions Moses' readers were asking were not questions about the Big Bang or natural selection or what Charles Darwin wrote or the whole field that we call modern science. That discussion was not going on then, and that's not why the book of Genesis was written in the first place. Moses was writing to people who were saturated in a culture of polytheism, the worship of many gods. In the Mesopotamian culture, lots of gods were being worshipped. Lots of objects were worshipped. The sun was worshipped. The moon was worshipped. People would look to the stars to give them guidance. They actually thought their future was so controlled by the position of stars and planets. It's hard to believe that human beings were once so superstitious to believe something as silly as that. Would you agree? But I guess at one time people were. They did not believe there was a connection between these gods and morality and ethics or justice. They believed that human beings were created as lackeys or gophers to provide food for the gods or to be slaves to the gods. People were just an insignificant afterthought. Therefore, inhumane practices and bizarre rituals like infant sacrifice was often a part of the worship of these gods. The writer of Genesis is writing in that context, and he's very concerned with these ideas. And he uses the linguistic raw material of that day, that age, and that culture to make these affirmations that are utterly unique in the history of the world. And here they are. There is one God. This God is the one who created the heavens and the earth. Creation is good, but it is not God. Human beings in particular are unique as they were created in the image of God. Something has gone wrong, and we are not what we should be. Death and decay were not a part of God's original design, and they've greatly messed up God's creation. Death and decay came about as a result of sin. The God who created this world is our only hope to set it right because we cannot do it on our own. That's what is at the core of those opening passages of Genesis. The writer, in my opinion, is not trying to answer questions posed by modern science because there was no modern science back then. Genesis 1 was not intended to be a science textbook. That's a different agenda than the writer had in mind. Did God create the world in 6 consecutive 24-hour days? Or did He do it over a longer period of time? And does it make a difference to our faith to believe one over the other? There are some who would argue that if you don't believe that God made the world in 6 consecutive 24-hour days, you've undermined the credibility of the entire Bible and you've greatly diminished the power of the gospel. There are others who would say a literal interpretation of the first chapter of Genesis is incompatible with the findings of modern science, and you have to commit intellectual suicide to do so. Could the whole universe have been started by God in 6 consecutive 24-hour days? Absolutely it could. For that matter, God could have done it all in one 24-hour day. He wouldn't need 6 to do it in. Could God use a lengthier process like natural selection for the development of life on earth under His guidance to bring about human beings who are unique and made in His image? I think God could use any kind of process that He wanted to. But the point of the writer of Genesis is something much bigger than the chronological blow-by-blow scientific blueprint of how the world came into existence. Now, I've hosted speakers in other churches that I've served who present a young earth view with great arguments and passion. They maintain if we take the 6 24-hour consecutive days of Genesis 1 and then add up all the genealogical records in the Bible, you get a date for the earth that's somewhere around 6,000 years old. Maybe you're in that camp. All I'm saying is the intent of Genesis 1 or the genealogical records in particular in the Bible was not meant to be used to prove the age of the earth. I just don't think that. You may disagree with that, and that's okay. But you know what? You don't have to be my twin to be my brother. But in my opinion, the age of the earth is not a matter of salvation, and it shouldn't be a test of fellowship. So I think Moses' point was something more basic and simple and relevant to his time and his intended audience. And here it is. Here's what Moses was saying. Don't worship the sun. Don't worship the moon. Don't look to the stars for guidance. God alone is God. God made the whole thing. It's only God who should be worshiped. Genesis was not written to establish the age of the earth. It was written to introduce the God of the ages. That's what Moses is saying. And there's nothing in the field of operation science that contradicts that in any way. Now, when someone who works in the field of origin sciences says, you know, logic and science has disproved God, then it's time to disagree and push back. But I'm convinced that the field of science itself is not the enemy of faith. In fact, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Now, don't tell anybody I told you this. It's just between us. Many scientists believe in God. Now, don't tell anybody that. Many scientists believe in God. One scientist who believes in God said it is precisely Genesis' understanding of creation having unity and order and rationality that has laid the foundation for the whole scientific enterprise. I believe that not only is faith not incompatible with science, but the Bible, when understood correctly, is not threatened by science in any way. Christianity was, in fact, one of the factors that made the rise of the entire field of science actually possible. A Princeton professor named Diogenes Allen writes, "We've begun to realize from its very birth, science owed a great deal to Christianity." And according to Professor Allen, he says there are attitudes Christianity has that were indispensable for science to be able to rise. For example, Christians, unlike Plato, the famous Greek philosopher who formed the worldview of many in the ancient world, Christians believe that matter is good since God created it. So to study creation would be a good thing. The world was created by an orderly and rational God. Therefore, there is reason to expect not chaos, but order and reason and law and regularity in creation and in nature. On the other hand, since God is free and omniscient, we could never predict ahead of time what it is He would do. So we have to investigate, we have to study, we have to experiment. In March 2009, NASA sent out a telescope named after Johannes Kepler. Kepler was the great mathematician and astronomer from the 1600s. Listen to what Johannes Kepler wrote. God, like a master builder, has laid the foundation of the world according to law and order. God wanted us to recognize those laws by creating us after His image so we could share in His own thought. The vast majority of the pioneers of science, William of Ockham, Francis Bacon, Galileo, Blaise Pascal, Louis Pasteur, Isaac Newton, viewed their work as learning to think God's thoughts. George Washington Carver said he started his groundbreaking research and studies on peanuts by holding up a peanut and saying, "God, what's in a peanut?" So here's one takeaway from this message. Here's just a thought today. Sometimes Christians dishonor the role of science. Sometimes Christians say dumb things in the name of God. Sometimes Christians belittle scientific research. Sometimes Christians create well-intended but misguided controversies based on pushing their agendas, but can end up dishonoring the name of the Lord Jesus and losing influence with people who love science. Let's don't do that. Let's love God with all of our minds. Let's be open to learning from the science of creation because all truth is God's truth. Are you still with me? All right, that's good to hear. I think I lost about 10% of you. But I'm hoping you'll come back to me. Observation number 2. Science itself taps into a sense of mystery and wonder that there is something about human existence that's beyond science itself. Let me say that one more time. Science itself taps into a sense of mystery and wonder and a sense that there is something about human existence that is beyond science itself. There is something that seems to suggest that the universe had us in mind. The deeper you get into origin sciences, the more it raises interesting questions about this wild and wonderful planet that we live on. Over the last 40 years, there's been a lot written about a dynamic that is called the anthropic principle. This principle proposes that the universe seems to be fine-tuned to be just the sort of place that can support and sustain life. There's a scientist named Brandon Carter who introduced this idea about 40 years ago. Ironically, it was on the 500th anniversary of Copernicus. Copernicus was part of the revolution that proclaimed, hey, we think the earth revolves around the sun. Many people who don't believe in God say that Copernicus's finding damaged the credibility of faith because it said that the earth was no longer the center of the universe and not such a special place. But Brandon Carter said, no, quite the contrary. The more we learn from science, the more we find out that our universe in general and the earth in particular is a remarkably special place because so many things would have to be exactly right in order for life to arise are exactly right. So many laws, contingencies in biology and physics that would have to be fine-tuned precisely are fine-tuned precisely. Carter gives some examples of this. There are tons of them. Let's give you a couple of them. The proportion of the mass of a neutron of hydrogen that is converted into energy in nuclear fusion is called a strong force. A strong force. The value of this particular equation is 0.007. Did you hear that? 007. Does that number ring a bell with anybody? That's what scientists call the strong force. I think it should be called the bond force. Shaken, not stirred. Now, it turns out that if the value of that strong force were just a tiny bit different, if it were 0.006, then the whole universe would be hydrogen, and thus there would be no life. If it were the tiniest bit larger, 0.008, then all hydrogen would be converted. There would be no hydrogen at all, and thus there would be no life. The strong force has to be precisely 0.007 for our universe to produce and sustain life, and guess what? That's exactly what it is. The precise orbit of the earth, our distance from the sun, the existence of the moon, the size that it is, the distance from the earth that keeps our axis tilted at 23.5 degrees, that keeps the earth in a particular zone where it's not too hot and it's not too cold, it's just right. And anybody want to guess what physicists call that zone? The Goldilocks zone. I'm not making that up. Just like baby bear's porridge. We live in the Goldilocks zone. There are so many examples of the anthropic principle, the overarching name for the discovery in science, that there are dozens of variables that contribute to the existence of life, and that each variable had to be exactly the way that it was in order to produce a universe that could sustain life. The strength of gravity, the properties of water, the properties of carbon, the exact rate of the expansion of that initial burst of creative energy, or what some call the Big Bang, which if it had varied one tiny little bit in the first 1/1,000,000th second, would have either collapsed back in on itself or exploded. On and on in the universe, on our planet, in biology, in physics, all these things that would have to be fine-tuned for life to exist, turns out they are exactly fine-tuned for life to exist. One physicist named Freeman Dyson writes these remarkable words from a physicist. It is as if the universe saw us coming. Isn't that remarkable? It is as if the universe saw us coming. Here's another quote by Fred Hoyle. Fred Hoyle is a scientist, by the way, who coined the phrase Big Bang. Fred Hoyle said, the probability of life originating on Earth is no greater than the chance that a hurricane sweeping through a scrapyard would have the luck to assemble a Boeing 747. And the psalmist said, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of His hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. Friends, listen to me. Those aren't just pretty words. That's not just Hebrew poetry. That's not just someone sitting around saying, twinkle, twinkle, little star. That represents some very deep thinking about the nature of the way things are. And it is that kind of thinking of all that we see as the creation of an orderly mind that made the whole rise of science possible. Science seems to be suggesting that somehow the universe saw us coming. Are you still with me? Observation number 3. The deepest questions of life cannot be answered by the scientific method. The deepest questions of life cannot be answered by the scientific method. You remember the scientific method we all learned about in a high school science class? We make observations and we generate a hypothesis. We test our hypothesis. If it is confirmed, it might lead to a theory. Perhaps that theory can be empirically verified and so on. That's the scientific method. It's a wonderful, amazing process in its field. The scientific method has gained an enormous amount of prestige, and to a large extent in our culture and in many educational circles and in much of the media. And there is an assumption, particularly in our culture, that only the scientific method enables one to know something. Therefore, we cannot really know anything, for instance, about God. You can be an educated person without knowing anything about God, they would say. Therefore, we cannot really know anything about moral values. And that's part of why we have to come to grips with all this, friends. This kind of thinking saturates our culture, much like the polytheism saturated the culture of Moses. This saturates our culture. But here's the observation. The deepest questions of life cannot be answered by the scientific method. And we must answer them in order to live meaningful lives. Whether or not we do it intentionally, formally, we all have to take a position on questions like this. Why are we here? What is our purpose? What should we do? How should we live? G.K. Chesterton was a great Christian writer and thinker in the early 20th century. He said that the real mystery is that anything exists at all. Theories like the Big Bang and natural selection and evolution attempt to explain how the mechanism of change might take place, but they do not explain how existence springs from nothing. You see, the real trick isn't changing one thing into another thing. The real trick is creating something out of absolutely nothing. I've told you the story before, but I can't find a better one, so I'll tell it again. A group of scientists decided that human beings had come a long way and they no longer needed God. And so they picked one scientist to go tell God we don't need him anymore. And the scientist says, hey, God, we can make it on our own now. We know how life started. We know the secret. We can clone human beings. We can do it without you. God listens patiently. And he says, all right, before I leave you on your own, what do you say we have a man-making contest? The scientist says, okay, we're up for it. Let's do it. God says, now we're going to do it just like I did it back in the day with Adam. The scientist says, sure, no problem. And he reaches down to get some dirt. And God says, no, you go get your own dirt. See, that's the trick. That's the trick right there. You come up with your own dirt. You start with nothing, you come up with something. Talking about something that changes into something else and how long it takes for something to change into something, that's not the real trick. The trick is how do you get from nothing to something, and why is there something in the first place? That's what we all want to know. And once we know that, then we need to know, why are we here? That's an important question. Now, part of the question, why are we here? That's a question of origin. But a deeper part of that question is, what are we here for? What's our purpose? What is our meaning? Meaning always involves context. You always derive meaning from context. If you want to know what a letter means, you look at the word in which it is embedded. If you want to know what a word means, you look at a sentence. If you want to know what a sentence means, you look at the entire page. You look at the book. If you want to know what does a life mean, you have to step back and look at a larger context of that life and the world in which we find ourselves. Personally, I don't understand how you could find a meaningful life in a meaningless universe. I don't understand that. But that's one possibility. We live in a meaningless universe. Bertrand Russell was a famous atheist from the previous century. And he put it like this. Listen to what he wrote, his view of life. In the visible world, the Milky Way is a tiny fragment. I agree with that. Within this fragment, the solar system is an infinitesimal speck. And the speck of our planet is a microscopic dot. On this dot, tiny lumps of impure carbon and water, complicated structure, crawl about for a few years until they're dissolved again into the elements of which they are compounded. How would you like to have that read at your funeral? There was a little lump of carbon crawling around for a while. Now it's gone. Maybe you'd sing this song, "This little lump of mine, I'm going to let it dine." And one day it died. Maybe Bertrand Russell's right. Maybe the universe is a machine. That's all it is. A glorious accidental machine. Maybe one day it'll all wind down. Maybe when the universe collapses in on itself, maybe when the sun expands or explodes, maybe when a giant asteroid hits the earth and we're destroyed, then maybe all of life as we know it will end, and it will not have made any difference in that day, whether I love my kids or I abandon them. We're all just randomly, cleverly arranged molecules anyways. Maybe that's how it is. But I don't know anyone who consistently lives with that idea. No one. Maybe that's the way it is, but here's what I believe. Human beings have a hunger for meaning. Now, it doesn't prove that meaning exists, but because you have a desire for significance, it is suggestive. We have a hunger for food. And it would be an odd thing if it turned out that we were creatures with a hunger for food where there is no such thing as food. We have a thirst for water. That doesn't prove that water exists, but it would be odd that if we had a thirst for water and we were in a universe where there was no such thing as water, we have an appetite for sex. That doesn't prove that sex exists. But it would be odd if we lived in a universe where there was no such thing as sexual intimacy. We have a hunger and thirst for meaning. And maybe part of the reason why we have this hunger and thirst for meaning is we were designed for it. God made us to hunger and thirst for righteousness and meaning. I want to end with a very simple procedure, if you will indulge me. Now, what I'm about to do, it doesn't prove anything. I want you to know that. This is not a logical argument, but I'll tell you what it does do. It helps my simple mind get a handle on these big heavyweight ideas, and I think it might help us understand a little bit of why the Bible's claims of creation resonates so deeply within us, okay? I had a birthday a couple months back. I had a birthday in November. I turned 51, and it was a beautiful day because on that day, my wife made for me my favorite cake. I'm more of a pie person, okay? But my favorite cake is an Italian cream cake. Oh, it's so good. It's so good. Now, let's just say that I have here before me a mixing bowl from which an Italian cream cake would be put together. And let's just say I stand here and I wait until an Italian cream cake appears in that bowl. How long am I going to stand here until that happens? Probably a long stinking time. We're going to go beyond lunchtime waiting for that, okay? But let's say that I have here all the ingredients that would make an Italian cream cake. For instance, we have eggs. Now, don't ask where the eggs came from. They're just here, okay? So I put the eggs in the bowl. And I have some flour. So I put some flour in the bowl. And we have to have some confectionery sugar. We put that in the bowl. And we have to have real sugar. And so I'm going to put that in the bowl. And Crisco. Everybody remember Crisco? Anybody cook with that anymore? So we're going to put that over here. And buttermilk, a secret ingredient. You got to have some buttermilk. Let's put that in the bowl here. And then we're going to put in just a pinch of salt, just a pinch of salt. And then we have some nuts for the icing, some coconuts, and we're going to put all that in the bowl right here. And then cream cheese for the icing. Yeah, we're going to put all that right there in the bowl. And let's say I have all the ingredients in the bowl, and I'm going to wait until an Italian cream cake appears from those ingredients. How long am I going to wait for that to happen? Probably a long stinking time. Okay? But I have all the ingredients here. And I have them all in the right proportion. But ingredients alone does not a cake make. How do you make a cake? Some intelligent being with a will, with great effort, and with heaping, helping portions of love has to say, let there be cake. And behold, there was cake. And it is good. Behold, it is good. Now, last week I gave $10 bills away in every service, but nobody's getting any part of this. I love you, but I don't love you that much. Do you understand this is what the Bible tells us about the creation story? This is why we love the story of creation. Science can tell us about all the ingredients. Science can tell us about the mechanisms by which they're put together. It's a fascinating and wonderful thing. One of the main reasons that people can do that is because people believe there was an order and meaning and rationality behind the universe because it was made by God. Science can tell us a lot about that, and we ought to honor and esteem scientists who do that sort of work. But Jesus Christ says there was a baker back there somewhere, and however many years ago, one day he said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and it was good, and it was made out of love, and it was made for you and for me. That's what Jesus taught. Jesus said, you hunger for knowledge because you were made that way. You hunger for purpose because you were made that way. And in Jesus Christ, we find we're not an accident. Someone designed us. Someone saw us coming. And Jesus says, you can get to know Him through me. That's why I have come, so that you can know Him. Would you stand with me right now? Father, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for the opportunity that you've given to us. First of all, just to look at what you've made, knowing that we are a part of that creation. When we look at ourselves, as the psalmist said, when I consider the universe, when I consider the heavens, when I consider the stars, and then I look at myself, I say, what is man, oh God, that you should be mindful of us, that you would care about us? And yet, when we look at Jesus, who is the fullness of the Father, whom Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. In Him, all the fullness of deity dwells. When I look at Jesus and He says, you follow me, you go through me, you trust me, and I will take you to the Father. And Lord, thank you, not just for this creation that is so vast and wondrous and mysterious and awesome. Thank you for the new creation that you have made us in Jesus Christ. That you make us a new creation in you, Jesus. Thank you for that invitation. Thank you for coming to link that awesome, vast, mysterious, unfathomable, uncontainable God. He comes in a person and He says, follow me. Thank you for that, Jesus. We love you and we want to follow you even more, and we trust you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.